Greetings, gentlemen, and welcome to the terminal video of this year. Now, I don't want to turn this video into a conventional review of Cyberpunk 2077. I'm certainly going to add my 2 cents and say what I think about what I've played and the game itself. But frankly speaking, I'm much more interested in, and I think we all should be, in the perception and reception of the game with respect to its release, CD Projekt Red, and a broader perspective on the gaming industry. And inevitably, that's going to make up the bulk of this video. But before we go there, we should talk about the game itself. I played Cyberpunk for a good many hours, and I think it is overall a good game. Now, overall good means, of course, that it's not without points that I could criticize. For example, the AI in Cyberpunk 2077 is absolutely atrocious. Trash can atrocious bad. It is the worst AI I've encountered in years and years and years. And this has the secondary effect that it makes combat extremely boring and unrewarding. Now, I should say for the record that in my experience with all of CD Projekt Red's games, they've never had a really good track record with combat. Even with The Witcher 3, which I think is a very good game overall, in that game, it is the combat that, without question, is the weakest point of the game. It's not the worst combat I've ever experienced, but it's just not good. And the enemy AI is also not amazing, and in general, the combat is not terribly challenging. The only challenge I ever had in Witcher 3 was the final boss, namely Detlef, in Blood and Wine on the hardest difficulty, and that was pretty challenging. It wasn't an insurmountable challenge, it wasn't impossible, it wasn't Dark Souls-like, but it was reasonably difficult. Everything else was a piece of cake. So, right off the bat, I think that CD Projekt Red has issues making combat fun and engaging, and the absolutely terrible AI in Cyberpunk 2077 contributes to it even more. The enemy will just stand there. They don't actively search when you're sneaking, because I've been playing a sneaky character. It's very, very bad. And it goes beyond the combat to just everyday stuff. The landscape of Night City is huge, and the city, at an initial glance, appears to be pretty lively. But the reality is that the characters, the AI characters, are just walking back and forth. They're walking back and forth. Rarely do you see them engage with things. And that takes away from the life of the city itself. And semi-finally, the driving is absolutely atrocious. The car and bike handling is terrible. These are not features that I was particularly obsessed with, but they're just really bad. So those would be my greatest criticisms of the game. There are some other criticisms one could make, but overall, the main quest is very engaging, in some cases quite touching, depending on which ending you choose, if a little short. For some reason that I don't entirely comprehend, people had complained that the main quest in Witcher 3 had been too drawn out, too lengthy. And I like that sort of thing, frankly speaking. By way of contrast, the main quest in Cyberpunk 2077 is very, very curtailed, to the point where it really bothers me. And as a consequence, I think they try to fill up a lot of the game with what I could only describe as filler content. There are many of these so-called gigs that you get from fixers. Fixers are middlemen that provide contracts to mercenaries, and the fixers mediate the contract between the person doing the contract, you, the mercenary, and the contract giver. Now, there are dozens and dozens of these, and they're largely uninteresting. Some of them are kind of interesting, but they're not very impactful or consequential, and the best utility they have is to level up your character and to make some money, to make some euro dollars, eddies. Now, you shouldn't compare apples and oranges, I know, ideally, but it is a title, an acclaimed title by CD Projekt Red, Witcher 3, and I have to say that the number of side quests between Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, let's just say the number of side quests are much fewer, but they're much more interesting. They're much more engaging. I could name perhaps half a dozen off the top of my head that really stuck out, that are memorable. There are a whole bunch that weren't directly related to the main quest, but nonetheless very compelling and interesting. There are some of those in Cyberpunk, but a lot of the side content is just filler. And on top of that, you have a ton of loot you're constantly looting and picking up. And in any event, again, I didn't want to talk too much about the game. It's not really my style, and I'm not a gaming channel. But I think it's a good game and could be polished quite a bit. And if they polished it, if they made the AI much more engaging, it could go up several notches. So would I recommend this game to most people? Probably not. I would recommend that you wait for all the DLC and all the expansions to come out, for it to be polished and patched up, and then play it. And by then, I would strongly suspect it'll be a very good game. It'll go from good to very good. But I don't find that nearly as interesting as the sociology behind game releases and the customer audience's perception of these things. It goes without saying that the word hyperbole would be an understatement if we wanted to use it to describe what the reactions had been on the part of the gaming community, and in particular in part of gaming channels. Channels that formerly had been loyal devotees of CD Projekt Red, turning on the flip of a dime and throwing fecal matter at CD Projekt Red, as it were, and the fans expressing their bitter disappointment. Now, at first glance, you would ask yourself if these people had ever played a video game before. Because even though I was a little disappointed by CD Projekt Red and the game, I cannot fathom the colossal expectations a lot of people had. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, and we can go into them, but the way people have gone about this, I think, is inexcusable. The biggest issue with the reaction and reception of the quote-unquote community has been outright lies. People have said this is the worst release ever. Many people have actually said that. It's simply not true. It's factually not true. No Man's Sky, Andromeda, the things that are really good, for example, like lip sync and what have you in the game, they don't pay attention to that. This is objectively not the worst release ever. It wasn't a great release, but it's not the worst release. But we live in the era of hyperbole and exaggeration, and everyone needs to make their money off of clickbait reviews, so that's what people did. Worst release ever. On top of that, I've rarely encountered any bugs playing the game. Most of the issues people were facing were older generation consoles, which is to say, trash can computers that are on their way out anyway. I would also say that CD Projekt Red committed an enormous error in committing themselves to producing this game for last generation consoles. They still would have made good money and would have been okay had they only produced the game for PC and the newer generations of consoles. So had they avoided that, I think a lot of the issues, not all of them, but a lot of the issues that have arisen in the subsequent kerfuffle between the public and CD Projekt Red, they would have been effectively non-issues. So this is a lesson to be learned if and when the next generation of consoles come out, that it would behoove CD Projekt Red, frankly speaking, to not release on these older platforms. It's just not worth it. And again, most of the technical buggy errors, not all of them, most of them were related to these older generation of consoles. But let's look at the question of hype. Of course, when people engage in a marketing campaign, it's going to produce some degree of hype. Everyone does this, and everyone is guilty of it. And many of us, to varying degrees, buy into the hype. And I think there has been wrongdoing on both on the part of CD Projekt Red and on the part of the quote-unquote fan base. Things were promised in the game that were not brought to bear. You can note when you play the game that things are just missing. Things that are very overt. For example, there's an attachment called Gorilla Arms. It says in the text of the game, underneath Gorilla Arms, it allows you to tear open locked doors. It does nothing of the sort. And it's clear that they wanted this to be in the game. They had advertised that. They had talked about it. They had shown it in previous footage. But for whatever reason, it didn't make it off the cutting room floor, and it wasn't implemented in the game, even though the text still states that. Which tells me that the game, without question, needed more polish and more work. At least another year, I suspect. And this is where the rubber really meets the road. To use the lingo from Cyberpunk, we have a conflict between corpos and developers in this case, as well as the public. The developers had sent out warning signs saying that it's not ready, but the corpos had taken over, and the way they were managing the release campaign, in retrospect at least, hindsight being 2020, was absolutely terrible. There were a number of delays this year, obviously, but after the first delay, they shouldn't have announced any other specific dates. They should have stuck with their motto, it's ready when it's ready, and if need be, released sometime next year. That would have been a reasonable course of action. But I suspect, and this is only informed speculation, that shareholders, corpos, were getting greedy, and they wanted the product out, and they wanted to make their money. And this sort of conflict exists everywhere in game development. There's a conflict of interest, if you will, between game developers who want to polish it as much as possible, who ideally want to perfect the game, and sometimes to their detriment, because at some point in time, you need to ship the product, even if it's not the perfection you might have envisaged, and shareholders who simply want to make a profit. At the end of the day, that is what all these companies represent, a means of making profit. Yes, the developers might have an interest in the art and the technique, but the shareholders don't. All they care about is making money. So there's that conflict of interest. And it's not the first time. What's different about this, in say contrast to EA and the relationship BioWare has had, is that BioWare is a subsidiary of EA, whereas CD Projekt Red is just CD Projekt Red. And I think one of the contributing factors to this debacle, if you want to even call it that, I don't think it is, in fact, I'm using intentionally hyperbolic language there, is that for years the public was highly forgiving of BioWare because they could simply ascribe the many flaws and faults and rushed out poor products to the evil influence of EA, the publisher. After a while, that didn't sit anymore. After a while, we had begun to realize that BioWare simply wasn't the BioWare of old, and they were functionally dead, and that's what they are. They are functionally dead. But for a long time, they were still in the good graces of the public because they thought that EA was responsible. But by way of contrast, CD Projekt Red has fallen much more rapidly from grace. And why? I think in part because CD Projekt Red is CD Projekt Red. They are the publisher. They are the developer. There is no middleman there. They're not a subsidiary of somebody else. So they seem to represent themselves. And a lot of the goodwill that was shown to them, which I think was hyperbolic in many cases, well, that dissipated with it. Who's ultimately guilty here? Well, it's a little bit of all parties involved. CD Projekt Red did bamboozle people with slogans such as, "We leave the greed to others," which probably isn't a good statement to use at the current moment. And people bought into that themselves and overhyped it. They thought that CD Projekt Red were somehow their friends, that they gave out this free DLC, which they did, and published these really nice expansions, which they did. And these expansions were like entire games to themselves. I'm talking about Blood and Wine and Hearts of Stone. And yes, that's all true. But CD Projekt Red, at the end of the day, is a company trying to make money. And the way they do it is making games. And there's another factor here, and this is very much informed speculation. We don't really know if this is the case. But it could be that the original owners of CD Projekt Red wanted to take their time. But if you do a bit of cursory investigation, you'll find out that A, CD Projekt Red is a publicly traded company, and the owners only own about 28% of the shares, the original owners, and that as a consequence do not have the same influence they otherwise would have if they had 51% plus. It might very well have been that because of their limited shareholder power, they couldn't push through the things they actually wanted, and the greater greed of the other corpos took over. We don't really know. And there's a final element here as well. This year has been, for many people, a very, very bad year indeed. And so people quite simply were looking forward to something that would cheer them up. A lot of people had put their stock in this game. A lot of people thought that Cyberpunk would be not only otherworldly, which was a completely unrealistic expectation, let's be honest, but also the solution to the problems of the misery that this year had brought about in them. And frankly speaking, although that's understandable, probably was not a realistic expectation. A game is a game. A game is not going to deliver the goods on personal salvation. So what we really see here is a confluence of many factors coming together And we end up in this situation where we had catastrophically unrealistic expectations on the part of the fan base, a little bit of titillizing and tantalizing on the part of CD Projekt Red, and a massive case of mismanagement, or arguably proper management, because the game is still sold really well despite some dissatisfaction. So who knows if from the corpo perspective they did the right or wrong thing. Going forward though, I think we could make some reasonable predictions. And I think like every major game publisher / developer over time, CD Projekt Red will be marked down to just another publisher and or developer. Obviously, this is on the public, but we all know that phrase, you either die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain. Well, game developers and publishers have gone through several iterations of this. I remember when BioWare were the heroes, and eventually they turned to the villain. This is all in the public. Neither developers nor publishers are heroes. They're just people trying to make a product to make money with that product. But the public does apply this view to them. And yeah, in a sense, CD Projekt Red has fallen from grace. But long term, I don't think they're going to be terribly affected by that. Long term, EA has not been affected by their terrible reputation, and neither has Ubisoft. It is what it is. So CD Projekt Red will probably recover, whether it's financially or otherwise, with their reputation not necessarily intact. I mean, they're no longer the hero, right? They've become the villain, in air quotes. They're not really the villain at all. But I strongly suspect that they will continue to sell their products. So as always, please leave a like, share the video, hit the bell icon to be informed of the forthcoming videos. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you, and have a good transition into the next year. Take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.